day of Metaforum X. For those who might join us only today, I would like to just very briefly say a few words about how our programs look like. So today we have a couple of panels ahead. You can see the programs all over in the room. We also set up the program calendar with or the schedule with abstracts and bios you can access via the QR codes or printed versions. So we will start the morning session with the Beyond the Institutional System Culture Work in the Era of Permacrisis panel. We will start with Sepp Eckenhaussen's presentation, which is going to be a keynote presentation that will both address and outline the directions to which the discussion will unfold. Hopefully, after Sepp's keynote, we are going to open up the panel, so it's always going to be an open Q&A, just like yesterday. There's this microphone here. Please feel free to join the discussion anytime you have any questions or comments to add. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Sepp Eckenhaussen, who's an Amsterdam-based researcher and organizer, part of the Institute of Network Culture, and today his presentation is going to be about how art in permacrisis and how organizing art in the permacrisis looks like in the world beyond art. So the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Luke. Thank you also for the organizers for having me. Thank you for all the presenters of yesterday's presentations. I thought it was a really nice and rich program, and I think I'll also try and weave a lot of the different points that were touched upon into what I'm going to talk about. And I feel like today, if I have this sense correctly, it's going to be a bit the strategy day. So I hope that in this presentation I can raise some food for discussion for these discussions that we'll have today. Jasha, hello. You're in the big screen. Shall I maybe put you in the background? Is that maybe more comfortable for now? Yes. Okay. So in May of 2024, at the Institute of Network Cultures, we started the podcast, which you see here, website on the big screen, called Art in Permacrisis. We currently have 4 episodes out with Kuba Schroeder, Emanuel Braga, Katja Praznik, and Yazan Halili. We have 3 more in the making, in production right now, and then many more planned. We've so far covered topics like universal basic income, feminist art institutions, and a renewed class consciousness of the so-called Projectariat. I hope you all have either listened or will listen to these episodes. Find us in your favorite podcast app. So I will not use this time to go over all the lessons that we uncovered in the episodes, but I will talk a little bit more about the protagonist in the background, which is art workers on the one hand and permacrisis on the other hand. And maybe just a parenthesis on when I talk about art workers, I mean of course artists, but also curators, project managers, art handlers, researchers, critics, and all the other people who do independent or self-employed work in the art circulation. So the core topic of art in permacrisis is sustainable art circulation, or economically sustainable art circulation. Can we imagine and work towards a sustainable art economy beyond precarity? How would this change the distribution of artworks and money, the curriculum of art and design academies, the exhibition programs of museums, and the organization of collectives and unions? In the context of permacrisis, which is, after all, why we're here together today, this feels like a really daunting question, right? Like, how can we even talk about fair art if there are so many more urgent questions or crises that we are facing. The economy of the arts is notoriously unsustainable. This is a fact. But aren't there many more undeniably more relevant crises? However, I believe that permacrisis and the arts are deeply connected already by the inescapable shadow of more urgent matters cast on the question of the fair art economy. And I think this was also raised yesterday by Flora, that this very conference is an example of how these things are interrelated, right? Like some people managing to travel here, others not. Some were people getting paid for the travels, others not. So I think there's many interconnections that actually have mutual defining characteristics. So, what I would like to do here today is to briefly unpack this layered, complex relationship between art and permacrisis and see where it leaves us. Should we maybe once again declare the end of art, this time not as the end of the dialectics of history, but as a minor casualty to permacrisis? Or should we continue to try and prove the real value of art, autonomous value of art? Or should we fully embrace the creative industry politics, which proposes art and culture as a profitable and impactful endeavor for the so-called social good? In this last scenario, of course, art finds economic leverage by acting as a crisis solver. Is there, in this respect, maybe even a reason to celebrate the growing crises because the relevance of art grows along with them? Well, I want to start at daily life, right? At the reality, the slumbering crisis of precarity that most of us probably feel on our skin in daily life. I have experienced, and I assume that many of you have experienced, when I made the decision to become an art worker, that I was confronted by very strangely entitled people at birthday parties, confronting me with my bad life decisions. And the problem is that they're not really wrong. Like, systemically speaking, choosing a career in the art is an awful decision. Underpayment and unstable working conditions are normalized to the extent that artistic labor is nearly synonymous to precarity. For instance, in 2018, a UNESCO report on the working condition of art concluded, and I quote, "The largest subsidy for the art comes not from governments, patrons, or the private sector, but from artists themselves in the form of unpaid or underpaid labor." End of quote. Now, of course, this kind of structural precarity stands in a very stark contrast with the huge capital flows in the art market and the huge amounts of money also made by art dealers, traders, and a few lucky artists. Because just to give you some reference of recent numbers, according to a yearly art market report published by Art Basel, sales on the global art market totaled about $65 billion in 2023, which was, yes, 4% less than the year before, but still higher than the last pre-COVID year of 2019. With seeming ease, blue-chip galleries, fairs, auction houses, and to a lesser extent also public institutions, galleries, and museums flourish and continue to flourish over the backs of underpaid art workers. I know that this is probably nothing new for most of you here, and we know the questions that this leads to, right? Why should artists and freelance workers, who are the backbone of the art world, accept to continue living off a pittance? What would happen if we all just stopped creatively hiding the structural nature of our precarities? And yeah, just in short, is collective refusal possible, right? So then the next question is, why are these questions around for such a long time without being resolved, right? And then a lot of people point at art workers refusing to be organized, being too autonomous, too individual, etc. Fortunately, Dusan gave us a really strong example yesterday that this is actually not the case, right? People manage to organize. So there are at least 4 deeper structural issues that lead to the crisis of precarity that I want to bring to the table here, but probably there are more. First, there is the collective Stockholm syndrome, described by Hans Abing as the art ethos. One does not become an artist for financial gains, but to fulfill one's destiny, right? Therefore, poverty is not so much a problem as the proof of the real deal. Secondly, art workers are the archetypal workers of the future. With consistently rising numbers of self-employed workers, art and culture have been the perfect testing ground for neoliberal market policies, labor market policies, and together with delivery riders, taxi drivers, and other gig workers, art workers have been what we might call the flex avant-garde. Thirdly, there is a systemic similarity between the art market and the financial market as markets of pure capital, let's say. The product that we're dealing with here is totally divorced from any kind of use value and is totally speculative in its value creation and accumulation. Of course, in the case of the art market, this market derives its credibility from a complex system of aesthetic and critical discourse, as well as public museums, private galleries, auction houses, fairs, collectors, and media. But at the same time, we know also that the effects of this kind of market dynamic are quite banal in the way that they affect the daily life of art workers. Markets go up, artists are pumped, markets go down, and artists are dumped. This is just a simple reality and the so-called natural order of the market, right? And a final related issue is the continuous failure of emancipation by marketization that are still being tried by artists, and maybe rightly so, but there is also something going wrong there, right? The art market often sees disruptive online ventures aiming to emancipate the artist as a serious player in the game of speculation and value capture in their own right. But sooner or later, the real benefits of these disruption end up with the 1%. There's many really good examples from Kickstarter to Patreon and the fascinating case of the Artist Pension Trust. But I think the clearest example is the NFT market, which, as you probably remember, promised to emancipate previously underprivileged artists. But the same report that I just mentioned before about the art market shows that the NFT market has consolidated at about $1.2 billion in 2023, which is about 55 times smaller than the regular art market. And that by now also the NFT market is almost entirely dominated by legacy art market institutions and crypto traders, the so-called wills. So we can not even talk about an alternative system here anymore. So this, for the reasons of the structural precarity as an economic crisis, but I want to move on and also talk about precarity as a crisis of legitimacy, because we know that from every side, the societal position of art is under heavy scrutiny. To the left, it's a bourgeois privilege of virtue hoarders. To conservative, it's a hobby of the wokies. To liberals, it's a passion-driven dream job, which should be its own reward. And of course, Permacrisis itself puts further pressure or accelerates the erosion of art's social legitimacy. So how can we even talk about fair art production for a small group of privileged people in a world so broad by so many crises at the same time? Now, anyone who spent any time in the art world knows that artists grapple with these questions, and also institutions grapple with these questions, and this leads to this kind of ongoing stream of debates and conferences and so on about the so-called real value of art, which then inevitably end up with some argument or conclusion that art is socially indispensable in some form or another. And these narratives then come in different kinds of flavors, tailored to the different type of critique that we are facing. Right? To some, art is an important part of their national identity. To others, it's an autonomous realm of imagination, an essential part of Bildung, a comforting refuge, a catalyst of critical reflection, and so on. However, the slow collapse of Western welfare states has eroded the self-evidence of government support for art, or art as a social good in general, and made these arguments less convincing. So in the vacuum that occurred, the creative industries paradigm has risen to dominance, which proposes art, as I mentioned before, as a profitable and impactful endeavor for the social good, instead of the social good in its own right. So now, what is exactly the relation between these justification and crisis? Although very different from one another, the typical kind of justification narratives that we will find always are reactive and apologetic, asking for the powers that be to acknowledge, or to finally acknowledge the real value of art and to translate this acknowledgement into funding. And this, by the way, is also the case for creative industries lobbyists. The value of art is thus determined by the competence to respond to an agenda of urgencies determined by the party that declares the crisis, usually a network of governments, consultants, lobbyists, and scientists. And it's important to point out here immediately that this kind of apologetic justification from the field has not been very fruitful for art workers. Research shows that 40 years of resilience programs focus on creative industries development, cultural entrepreneurship, and the instrumental value of art have not managed to improve the composition of artists at all. And neither have they managed to re-establish the understanding of art as a public good, which is then the kind of side of the fight that I find myself on. But that hasn't been very successful either. However, the apologetic regime, let's say, has established a firm grip of what we might call permacrisis management on the arts. Permacrisis management in the art typically follows either of two criteria. First, art is legitimized by the creative crisis solving capacities of the art workers, which is the creative industry paradigm that I just described before. But then we also have a second flavor of legitimacy where art is found, the legitimacy of art is found as a subject of crisis, right? So being in the right crisis equals the right to exist, and equally being in or speaking of the wrong crisis can result in defunding. The clearest examples of this kind of logic, I think, are found in the post-socialist and so-called developing countries bordering on the so-called West. Yeah, I guess this is very well known to most of us here. In the former Soviet Union, as well as former Yugoslavia, but also, as I found out recently, in Lebanon and Palestine, the cultural fields are to a large extent shaped by the Western outreach programs, English language ground systems, and the funding criteria of open society values. So I think that we have to acknowledge that the crisis economy is a very prominent and material reality that we have to deal with. So at this point, I think it's helpful to have a little closer look at the script of crisis management and how it exactly works. And this has been really nicely studied by Janet Reutemann in her book Anti-Crisis. I brought it, I can show it around if you want to see it later. Reutemann explores crisis as an object of knowledge and as an important governmental tool, taking as a main case study the 27-28 subprime mortgage crisis that until not so very long ago was known as the crisis. And of course, we know that crisis is a kind of alienation of history, right? The discrepancy between the way things are and the way things ought to be or ought to have developed. Something went wrong. This is the crisis. And the judgment of the flaw is the construction of the crisis narrative. And this is what Reutemann focuses on, the crisis narrative in the way that we are being governed. The person or the institution that declares the state of crisis thereby always already implicitly posits the need of an otherwise, a new order of things, a new normalcy, that should become, the new normal. Of course, to reach the new normal, so-called unprecedented change is required. However, this change is always predefined and no longer open to discussion, right? The epistemological or even metaphysical proof, depending on how you look at it, of why an occurrence is in fact a deviation from the true or the right course of history is never really discussed or provided because, well, it's crisis. So among the ranks of corporate consultants and crisis and government officials, there is always a large cohort of risk assessors and managers. And what Reutemann really nicely shows is that these don't actually help predicting or preventing crises, but they provide the required legitimacy for crisis management once the opportunity presents itself in the form of a natural disaster, a pandemic, a war, an economic recession, and so on. So this work involves typically setting up the parameters of change while simultaneously selecting those elements of the old normalcy that should remain in place. Then, to zoom in a little bit on the 27 crisis that Reutemann discusses, she shows that we have witnessed such operation in the bailout of the banks during the financial crisis of 2007-2008, while, for instance, the rent control mechanisms did not change at all, interest control mechanisms did not change at all. And I'm sure we could find similar analysis of the World Economic Forum's so-called Great Reset during the COVID pandemic, right? Which then we know led to a lot of unrest and conspiracy theories because, well, yeah, crisis management does not explain itself. So to summarize, crisis management is used to first open and then immediately close the possibility of change. And this is what Yazan Khalili in the podcast calls the wheel of the crisis management, or the crisis wheel, you know? Close, open, close, open, close, open. So, Rotman's book is called Anti-Crisis, which suggests that she believes we should break the wheel of crisis. Maybe very similar to the argument Agnes made yesterday. But in the final chapter, in which he theorizes non-crisis, actually I find that not such a very strong chapter. It's really insightful how Rotman shows that crisis narratives mix empirical observation with the telos or the norms of history without providing the evidence of the judgment that history actually went wrong. But in terms of alternative, the book is not so helpful. Basically what she asks is, can we please just stop saying that history went wrong because of human error, right? And I understand this conclusion for an academic, but anyone trying to do something in the direction of political organizing, I think it should be quite clear to us that this is, given the political landscape, not enough. As many of you probably know, the Dutch government is working, as we speak, to officially declare an immigration crisis with no factual basis whatsoever. But the Prime Minister of our country publicly states, and I quote, "People feel crisis, so there is crisis." Right? And just to be clear, not even this is true. A survey showed that people don't even feel there's a crisis. More than half of the Dutch population doesn't believe that there's an immigration crisis. My point is more that we're dealing with a totally post-factual discourse here. So, descending even further to the realm of epistemological truth and addressing the lack of proof to describe occurrences as diversions from the telos of history in the narratives created by the powerful, I'm afraid that this is not going to cut our reality. It's not going to cut it for us. So I would like to do something a little different today. First, of course, we can be a little bit opportunistic and acknowledge that the technical possibilities of permacrisis management. Like any system of governance, the crisis economy and its management are a system of push and pull in which the participant can find some kind of agency. We can study the patterns of crisis management, not just to participate, but also to beat the funders at their own game. If we can safely assume that the next crisis will be declared soon, and with the small window of opportunity that will open, art workers can be ready and try to be the first to strike, right? We can then also see that in these periods between the windows of opportunity, we can use these times to develop the tools that might come in handy. We can build safe houses, free spaces, common pots, networks, governance systems, website research, and so on. I guess this is one of the reasons we're here today. But I think we can also do a little bit more than playing better at the game that is dictated by the powers that we live with. This summer I told a good friend about my interest in permacrisis and the podcast that we're doing. And this friend is a classical philosopher, like one of these people that reads Aristotle in ancient Greek. And he started really drilling me on this notion of permacrisis. Why do I insist on the notion that is so clearly self-contradictory, right? And he started going back to the etymological roots. What is the crisis declinine, the distinguishment here? And how do people react to it? What is the logia and the apology? And then at some point he told me, I think what you're looking for is an apocrisis. So instead of an apology, an apocrisis. A distinguishment, a counterposition, a countercrisis. And I started chewing on this proposal, and I think he was right. If crisis is a tool of governance, it must be possible to think beyond apologetic responses and tactical appropriations, and then start formulating this strategic counterposition. How to maybe implicitly, but certainly consciously engage with the power to define history. in my mind, this is really the crucial strategic question to deal with, certainly in the podcast, but maybe this is my proposal also during this very conference. If we are serious about organizing power, about autonomy, about autos nomos, our own laws, we cannot ignore the power to define the laws of history, which I don't mean writing the history books, but finding some kind of larger consistency between tactical interventions that we're working on. So then, how can we develop a speculative strategy that has the power to define uncertain futures and forms of organizing that will bring those futures closer to reality? Okay, now we come towards the end, 5 minutes left, very good. Then I will maybe ask you how we should use these or how I should use these 5 minutes. I have, of course, some ideas of what an apocrisis might look like. I'm currently working on a manuscript that looks at 6 ideas that Giti suggested to me might be called memes, because they kind of go around the art world and reproduce themselves almost automatically, because people find that there's some kind of promise in them of a more sustainable art economy. I can briefly introduce those. I can also maybe focus on one of them, which is infrastructural critique, which I think connects to the topic of the panel, but also has been floating around the conference yesterday and the day before. A third thing I can do is discuss very few case studies that I came across and kind of strategic and tactical similarities I find between the examples that I find promising. So these are 3 options. Maybe do you have a suggestion as moderator?
I think we can also just wrap it up here.
Do all.
Let's do all 6.
Also, the 6 topics? Okay. Well, first of all, fair practice. This was mentioned yesterday, right? Artist fee guidelines, fair practice codes, transparent contracts, etc. I think this is a really interesting direction and super helpful in actually making changes in the material reality of art workers and shifting norms and making previously invisible labor visible. It's also what Dusan mentioned yesterday. Like, you don't even have to get paid, but at least everyone is aware of what should be paid. Katja's book that was brought up yesterday was also very much about this. However, the problem here is that it can be interpreted by liberals as a repair of the market or a push towards a new market equilibrium. So I think there's a battle there. Second, cooperativism. There is a lot of talking about cooperativism, maybe from commons to cooperatives, right? To go a little bit away from the speculative nature of the commons towards something real, something material to be shared, governed together. Even the idea of collective income can come there. However, there's not very many functional examples in this field, so there's a lot to be researched there, mainly. Universal basic income, an interesting one. So many times, right, we come in these kind of conversations where people say, oh, if we just had basic income, everything would be different. I think it's a really powerful idea. There's the Art for UBI campaign, which I think is great because it doesn't focus on, basic income for art workers, but art workers for basic income for everyone, for instance. However, there's also a shadow side here that by just giving everyone money, what is created is not an autonomous citizen, but an autonomous consumer, right? So this is why also, from feminist perspective, people start arguing for universal basic services rather than income. So I think this is a really powerful direction, but needs to be crystallized more. Infrastructural critique, I just mentioned it, it's a notion offered to us by the late Marina Wischmidt, building on existing notions of infrastructure that kind of see infrastructure as the great repetitor, the invisible but material forces that reproduce power on a daily basis, and that become visible once their rupture appears. She then points at practices that we could maybe call third wave institutional critique practices that actually deal with this from artistic perspectives and that kind of appropriate or use infrastructural critique as a form of alternative institution building. So this is the question of how do we deal with the institution? And in which the institution is not necessarily the end goal, but it is a really important means because we need some kind of stability together, right? And if we don't want to just give up on everything that's been built, we need some kind of infrastructural critique. So I think this is a really interesting direction, and I think Documenta 15 was really good at pointing at the possibility of this. Can impact later, more later, but that's for now. Of course, the art union, right? I mean, we've seen a huge wave of unionization here in Eastern Europe, in the US. I think it was just 2 or 3 years ago that in the Power Top 100 of the art world, the union was on number 1 or 2. So there's some momentum here. But then there's also critical perspectives. How can you organize in a corporatist way, right, for art workers? Should we develop something like a social union? So these are, I think, lasting strategic questions, but still also very relevant to discuss today. And then, of course, the academy, right? What does economically responsible art education look like? How do we deal with the fact that people graduate and no longer even have the illusion of having a career in the arts? How do we educate the dark matter and consciously do this and continue to do this? To use Gregor Schlett's notion. Yeah. And what are the alternatives? So these are the six topics that I'm dealing with now. Also, toxic philanthropy is something that I've been researching. And maybe some idea of a gift culture beyond toxic philanthropy. So these are the topics I would lay on the table as what I find are interesting needs. Shall I leave it there?